Forward button. Again, we are in the book of 1 Samuel, looking at 1 Samuel chapter 9 tonight. We left off with 1 Samuel chapter 8. I don't have a PowerPoint, an expanded PowerPoint with us tonight, but I do have a picture that we will look at later that concerns a map that might help explain some of the events that are going on in 1 Samuel chapter 9. But as we talked about last week, 1 Samuel chapter 8 was a momentous turning point in the history of Israel because now Israel has wanted a king, and essentially they get their wish. God says that they're going to have a king, not like the king that they think they might have. This king's going to have problems. He's going to sort of be one who extracts a lot from the people. Their sons and daughters, their wealth, their land, their possessions, things like that, a lot of those things are going to go towards the king, and so the Israelites lose out on a lot of that, and so things aren't going to be perfect. But nonetheless, the people are still, at least have it in their mind that having a king is going to be good for them. They'll be like all the other nations, and they'll be accepted within these nations, but. We see at the end of chapter 8 that they come to Samuel, they tell Samuel that they're not going to change their mind, essentially. Samuel says, go to your city because the Lord is going to give them a king. And that's important when you think about 1 Samuel chapter 9, that you will see that it is God who gives Israel a king. It's not Samuel who goes and seeks to find a king to give the desire of the people. It's not the people that sort of come to a decision. About yank that audio cord out. It's not the people that have come to a decision and say, this is the guy we want as a king, but it's God who providentially will help Israel recognize who needs to be the king. So God has His specific appointed man in mind. So looking at 1 Samuel chapter 9, we are introduced to the man. His name is Saul. So let's begin by looking at 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 through 2. And I've sort of entitled this section Saul on a Journey or Saul on a Search, because that's essentially the first 14 verses describe a moment in Saul's life. So verses 1 and 2 of chapter 9, now there was a man of Benjamin whose name was Kish, the son of Abiel, the son of Zeror, the son of Berchorath, the son of Aphiah, a Benjamite, a mighty man of power. And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man and a goodly, and there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he, from his shoulders and upward. He was higher than any of the people. So again, when you think about verses 1 and 2 of chapter 9, we are given an introduction to Saul. Again, the king apparently was not provided right off the bat. You know, it's not like the people came to Samuel, they make their request to Samuel, Samuel tells them to go home, and Samuel immediately goes out and finds a king. You might think that might what would be following at the end of chapter 8, but that's not what happens. There's a little bit of patience here, and again, one of the themes that's in this chapter that's emphasized, I think, in several instances is that the providence of God is revealed and how Israel comes to having a king. You think about that in the contrast of miracles, right? And we think about, miracles and providence being God's control over nature. Miracles, as you can note in the New Testament, some places in the Old Testament, they always happen immediately. And they always happened rapidly. But the providence of God, obviously, sometimes relies on us being patient. And that's what's being emphasized. That's what's being shown here. But in verse 1, we are introduced to the family of Saul. It says that his father who was named Kish. And the name Kish just simply means bent. It doesn't necessarily have anything important to do, but it might be interesting to know his father's name was Kish. You notice that he is a Benjamite. He's of the tribe of Benjamin. And when you go back to the book of Judges, you might remember that the tribe of Benjamin was a very unpopular tribe. In fact, because of the events in the book of Judges, and it's covered in Judges chapter 20 and 21, where the people of Israel, the other 11 tribes, essentially want to end the tribe of Benjamin for some things that a group of people within Benjamin did, and Benjamin supporting those people. There are a lot of tribes that originally came to the conclusion that they wanted to wipe out the tribe of Benjamin, keep them from being able to reproduce. And so Benjamin was not thought of to be extremely highly, at least at one point in Israel's history. But it's interesting here that it will be of the tribe of Benjamin that God calls his first king to be over Israel. Now in verse 1, another thing that we point out there at the end says that Kish was a mighty man of power. Now, when you think about a mighty man of power, what's being emphasized here is that Kish is a man of nobility. Now, that'll seem odd later on in the chapter where Saul, it appears that Saul negates that or goes against that, but when it says that Kish was a mighty man of power, you're talking about a man that was of the nobility. And generally at this time, it was the case that sometimes the members of the nobility also were some of the most important fighters, the fiercest fighters, the warriors. I believe the tribe of Benjamin was known to produce many great warriors. And so generally the warriors, the most important warriors became the nobility. They generally were very wealthy. You see evidence of this in 2 Kings chapter 15. It talks about the wealthy in that passage, and I believe the word there that translates as wealthy is the same word that's translated as power in verse 1. 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 28, you sort of see the same idea. Jeroboam is called, I believe, to serve Solomon, but he's called a man of power, or a wealthy man. So Kish is it may not appear like it later on, but the truth that's presented in verse 1, Kish is an important individual. So verse 2, Kish has a son, and his name is Saul. We notice that it's not mentioned here where they live, but it might be important to note that they lived in Gibeah. That would be Saul's capital when he was king. 1 Samuel 10, verse 26 notes that Gibeah was the home of Saul. Now we see in verse 2 that he is a choice young man. Part of his description here. And it says that he's a choice man, a choice young man, a goodly. There was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. This can carry the idea of talking about his physical appearance, the idea that he's a somewhat good-looking individual. But what's being emphasized more importantly is his personality, his character. And it appears that in verse 2, the people that were around Saul thought he was a stand-up person, a man of good character. Now, obviously, this changes later on, but at least initially, it seems like Saul is a very good person. He has a pretty good reputation. You note, too, that he is also taller than all those that are around him, that he stood from his shoulders and upward, he was higher than any of the people. And if you think about what you want to have as a warrior to go out and defend you, you want somebody that's tall. If you're tall, generally you have the ability to put on more muscle and things like that. Obviously, you would not want me to go fight your battles for you. I'm not very tall compared to some other people. But Saul was he had everything in terms of what you would think about in a physical sense about what a king should look like. He had all of that to his advantage, all of that at his disposal. All of those natural traits made him look like he was a good king. So we're introduced to him in verses 1 and 2. Verses 3 and 4, we are given sort of the setting in which Saul, or the reason why Saul will eventually meet Samuel. Verses 3 and 4, it says, "And the donkeys of Kish, Saul's father, were lost. And Kish said to Saul his son, Take now one of the servants with thee, and arise, go seek the donkeys. And he passed through Mount Ephraim and passed through the land of Shalisha, but they found them not. Then they passed through the land of Shalom, and there they were not. And he passed through the land of the Benjamites, but they found them not." So again, we have an indication here. We're not exactly sure, but for some reason the donkeys of Kish have been lost. They're not just temporarily lost. They've apparently gone a great distance away based on what's being described here in this trip. And of course, if you think about it this time, donkeys are important animals. They do a lot of the manual labor. You don't have technology, you don't have machinery and things like that. So The donkey was used as a beast of burden. It did a lot of menial tasks that the normal human could not carry out, or did a lot of things that made it easier for humans to go about their everyday life. But either way, the donkeys, they've gone lost. They're important, and so there's going to be a search for these donkeys. Now you note in verse 3 that Kish says to Saul, "Take one of the servants with thee." In particular, that word "one" can also mean first of the servants or the head servant within the household. So think about it in light of who Joseph was in Potiphar's house, right? Joseph was a man who was a servant of Potiphar, but at the same time he was head over all things in Potiphar's house. He was the chief servant in the house, the chief steward, we could say. Well, apparently maybe this is the indication about who this man is. He's the chief steward of the house. And so he would have been in charge of the house, the animals, all the things around that the owner had, right? Because he was put in charge of that. So naturally, Saul will take his servant with him. Maybe this is the specific servant that's being talked about. One of the things that we'll note next week, but in verse 22, Saul will go and eat a meal with Samuel, and Saul and his servant are put in a place of high importance at that meal, which would indicate that the servant was not just a very lowly person. It seems like the servant probably was the steward of the house, and so he did have a position of prominence. And it would make sense too, right? If the head servant or the steward was in charge of everything that the owner had, then ultimately it's his responsibility that the donkeys have been lost, and it would make sense for that servant to go and find them. One thing that we note, and this is where we'll pull that map up for us, is that there is a long journey ahead for Saul and the servant. Verse 4. And the map's pulled up. I know it can be kind of hard to see. It's not very big, but this is about the best map that I could find. So you notice that the trip itself, what this map renders it's sort of like a large oval. And one of the things about Bible geography, it's not easy, it's not an exact process, especially with a lot of cities that aren't there today. But the idea sort of is that they're making a circular journey. Of course, that's being an oval, but they're making a round trip, so to speak. And it can be kind of hard to see the margin there, but the trip itself, based on that map, would have been somewhere in the vicinity of about 25 to 30 miles in total distance that they travel. So evidently, to search for, the donkeys of Kish, obviously they thought pretty highly of them because they searched 25 to 30 miles perhaps for them. So you get the idea there that they're at the bottom, Gibeah, right, just underneath Benjamin, that's where it starts. They head to the northeast, and they come back west and head back southwest, and so they would approach Gibeah from the north, right? You can see Shalim, rather. Both of those places are there, and again, that's maybe not an exact thing, but that gives you an idea about the trip that they're taking in verse 4. So they have not found the donkeys, and that's a problem. Because we come down to verse 5, Saul says, now it's time to go back. When they were come to the land of Zuph, Saul said to his servant that was with him, come, and let us return, lest my father leave caring for the donkeys and take thought for us. And so, in light of not finding the donkeys, Saul just essentially said at this point, we need to give up on it, we need to go back and to return home. Now, the land of Zuph, we don't know exactly where it's at. The word Zuph itself means honeycomb, and so it might have been a fertile land. But this is going to be the area where Ramah was located, which again, we keep in mind from 1 Samuel 7. This is where Samuel lives. It is interesting to know that one of Samuel's ancestors was named Zophai, which is actually similar to the word Zuph. But the importance here is that they're in the right spot whenever Saul comes to this decision. Maybe that's the providence of God at work here, that where Saul's going to come to this decision that we need to give up is right there in the same place close to where Samuel is. you think about the importance of searching for things that are lost. There's some things that are important to search after for, and you do it for a long time. If it's something that's of sentimental value to you, maybe a photography book of photos in the past of your family, you might cherish that, and if you misplace that, you might spend a lot of time looking for that. But say like your ordinary pen, if I left that in a school, if I was teaching and I left that at school and I lost that pen, I wouldn't think too much about it because it's just a pen. I can pick up a pen anywhere, really. I can go to the store and buy pens and get by with that. Versus if I lost my wallet, well, that's a lot bigger deal because I have money, I have my identification, driver's license, all of those things in there. And so I would spend a lot more time looking for something that is of a greater value. Well, at this point, Saul, they thought a lot about these donkeys, but at the end of the day, they were just donkeys, right? It didn't make sense for them to jeopardize themselves by trying to find the donkeys. And Saul, right, he understands his father, right? And any father would be like this. You wouldn't want to lose your child looking for something that they're searching after, right? Because a child's life is more important than whatever you lost, generally. Or that's how it should be. And this may be a point of application. Saul's response here, it seems to think very well of his own father, right? The father himself is not concerned with this loss of wealth more than his family. For some fathers, that may not necessarily be the case. There may be some fathers that are focused so much on work that they don't take time out for their family. And because of that, they don't have the greatest relationship with their kids. But what it appears to be with Saul here is he recognizes that about his father, right? To his father, Saul's life and the servant's life are more important than the donkey's lives. And so that's important to think about. I thought about this movie in light of that. And again, when I talk about a movie, I don't endorse everything about it. But there's a Christmas movie called Elf that has Will Ferrell in it. And one of the subplots to that movie concerns the father, and how his father goes from being a person that has everything in his life consumed with work to the point that he's even willing to work on Christmas Eve and Christmas Day and not spend time with his family. That's how he is at the beginning, and then later on he transforms and he really becomes more of a father figure in terms of being a family man. And that was that transition, and generally we want our fathers to be that way. Well, that's what Saul thinks of Kish. That probably speaks very highly of Kish. But in verse 6, we see that the servant's not ready to quit. Verse 6, the servant says, "Behold, now there is in this city a man of God, and he is an honorable man. All that he saith cometh surely to pass. Now let us go thither. Peradventure he can show us our way, that we should go." All right, so verse 6, the servant again says it's not time to stop looking for the animal. Again, if this is the servant that is the steward of the household, he would in part be responsible for losing the donkeys. And so maybe the servant's thinking that, I might face some form of punishment. I might face a demotion or something like that if I don't bring back what was lost underneath my watch. And so the servant's going to actually say we don't need to stop looking. But he actually has a good reason to do so. Verse 6, he says that there's in this city a man of God, and he is an honorable man. Again, maybe the providence of God here. They happen to be right near the city where Samuel is, where they're coming back on their trip, and they're at the right place to go see this man of God, who turns out to be Samuel. Again, when the phrase man of God, just again synonymous with the prophet of God, obviously these two individuals don't really know who Samuel is. They just know about his reputation. And that's a good point of application we can bring out here about Samuel. And that's the fact that people can know about your reputation without knowing about you personally. We ought to think about it in that light, especially whenever we're around people that we don't know very well. Whenever we're at the store and we don't know anybody, or we're at the bank or doing some type of task, or around people we don't know. And we might think to ourselves that, what we do or what we fail to do, it's not going to have any impact on the people around because we don't know them. But the fact is that your reputation can carry on without people knowing exactly who you were. That was true here for Samuel. His reputation was known. And the servant of Kish and that was with Saul had a lot of respect for Samuel. And even though he didn't know who he was personally. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind whenever we're around people that we don't know very well. Even though they may not get to know us personally, they see our reputation. They build their idea of our reputation based on what they see from us. And so if we have the mindset that it doesn't matter how I live outside of being around Christians, or having that a mindset similar to that, then the point being is that it could very well be that somebody holds a very negative reputation of us, and that comes back and bites us, and we pay the price for it. But Samuel was a man that was of good reputation. Even though his sons weren't, he had a good reputation. And so we always need to be careful and remember that people can know our reputation without knowing us personally. Well, that being said, are there any thoughts or comments that you want to add on to verse 6?
A lot of times we'll wear Maywood T-shirts out in public, and obviously if I'm doing something or acting a way I shouldn't, or say something I ought not with that shirt on,
right,
and that's going to be a real turnoff toward Maywood itself.
Yeah. Yeah, and the point that was brought up for those that were watching was that, if I go out and I'll wear a shirt, and a specific example was a Maywood Christian Camp shirt. If I go out and I wear that shirt around in public and I'm doing things that are immoral, and maybe I fail to do that which is right while wearing that shirt, well, people get an idea about what Maywood Christian Camp is, even though they don't know me personally. They've witnessed what I have either done or failed to do, and they can get that, they can develop a poor reputation of either yourself or the place that you represent, even though they do not directly know it. And so we always need to think about how we act, especially around those that we don't know very well. All right, so verse 6 again, they want to go and meet with Samuel, even though they don't know who he is. All that he saith comes surely to pass, now let us go thither. So Samuel's words, the confidence that the servant has is that if he gives us an answer concerning where the donkeys have gone, we know where to go to search for them, because everything that he says comes true. And we talked about that from 1 Samuel 3 verse 19, that God would make sure that none of Samuel's words would fall to the ground, or none of his prophecies would not be fulfilled. Habakkuk chapter 2 verses 2 through 3 re-emphasize that it's true of all prophets, that what they say, if they have received a message from God, what they say it is guaranteed that it will come to true. And people, you think about it in a practical sense, maybe it would be better for society, for society to operate off that principle. If somebody has a record of not being truthful or honest, probably not wise to put trust in them. And the opposite of that's true. If somebody is consistently true and is accurate about the things that he says, it's probably good to put your trust in them to a certain degree. All right, so Saul's question, what can we give this man? Verse 7. Saul says to his servants, but behold, if we go, what shall we bring the man? For the bread is spent in our vessels, and there is not a present to bring to the man of God. What have we? So generally it was customary for someone to give a gift if they wanted to go and receive a prophecy or a message from God from the prophet of God. You do see this occasionally in the Old Testament. 1 Kings chapter 14 verse 3. Jeroboam wants to know what God says by hearing from his prophet Abijah. And he actually sends his wife to go meet with Abijah. And before she leaves, Jeroboam makes sure that his wife has enough goods and gifts to give to Abijah in order to receive that message. So apparently that might have been the tradition here. That's what Saul's thinking, that if we want to receive a message from the man of God, we've got to be sure to give him something in return. Problem is, though, is that everything's spent. We don't have any food with us because obviously we've used that up by eating on this trip. We've run out of it. So how can we expect to receive anything in return would be the natural response. It doesn't make sense to go forward without having something to give to Samuel. But the servant says in verse 8, "Behold, I have here at hand the fourth part of a shekel of silver, that will I give to the man of God to tell us our way." A fourth part of a shekel. This is about 2.8 grams worth of silver. If we put that into today's currency, that is somewhere in the neighborhood of about $2.50 for us, which is not a lot of money. It might have been a lot of money about 100 years ago, but for us today, $2.50 is not a lot. But it still is something. Keep in mind, the understanding is to find that where the donkeys are at. They have no idea about what Samuel's going to say to Saul in terms of him becoming king. Everything at this point is focused on consulting with this man of God to find out where the donkeys have gone. And this will bring up an interesting point that, again, we'll talk about next week, maybe a point of application, and that's the fact that sometimes God gives us opportunities to serve Him when we least expect it. Right? Saul was not expecting to become king of Israel in this moment. But that's what Samuel's going to tell Saul, even though he's not expecting that. And whenever we go about our lives, there are going to be opportunities that we don't expect where we have the opportunity to either serve God or to serve others. And it's on us whether or not we choose to act on that opportunity. For Saul, even though he's going to have some problems, he will eventually act on this opportunity. And so we, at the same time, when God gives us, when opportunities are presented before us to serve God or to serve others, we need to act on them as best as we can. All right, verse 9. Verse 9 is sort of an interruption in a way. The author is sort of interrupting the story to explain something. Verse 9, "Before time in Israel, when a man went to inquire of God, thus he spake, Come and let us go to the seer. For he that is now called a prophet was before time called a seer." Now the word seer just simply means one who sees, and it indicates somebody who can see into the future, or through the inspiration of God has the ability to, has the perception that a normal man would not, because they're able to communicate with God. Now, you do have false seers in the Bible that claim to have messages from God, but they're in reality false. But the word prophet, in a general sense, a prophet didn't always have the ability to see into the future. For instance, Genesis chapter 20, verse 7, Abraham is called a prophet, but Abraham was called a prophet not in the sense of being able to predict the future, but just being a messenger or a speaker. So prophet's sort of a general word, and what the author is really doing is he's trying to explain to a later audience about why they call Samuel a seer, because later on they're going to be calling them prophets, right? Prophet Nathan, and so on and so forth, the major minor prophets. But the author just wants to explain that term is what's given to us in verse 9. So Saul agrees with the servant. Verse 10, Saul says to the servant, "Well said, come, let us go." So they went unto the city where the man of God was. In other words, verse 10, he said, "Well said," or you make a really sound argument, or you made a really good proposal. After all, if this man is a man of God, he has a knowledge of God at his disposal. He's obviously going to know whether or not we need to keep searching or whether or not we need to go back home. However, they don't know specifically in the city where he is at. And this is the last section we'll talk about tonight, verses 11 through 14, where Saul and the servant come into the city Ramah. Verse 11, "And as they went up the hill to the city, they found young maidens going out to draw water, and said unto them, Is the seer here?" Again, that's why verse 9 needed to be explained, because in verse 11, they ask for the seer. So one of the things that we note here in verse 11 is that, at least time-wise, things are going to be picking up relatively quickly. That'll be true in verse 13. So things are going, the idea is that it's sort of a gradual process, their journey, and they're coming to Ramah, but once they get into the city, things are going to happen very quickly because of the circumstances that are going on in the city. Now, the city of Ramah was apparently built on a hill because they went up the hill to the city. And again, cities were built on hills because it was a better way of protecting the city. And the picture that we should have in mind here is that Saul and his servants, they're on the outskirts of the city. In our minds, they could see the city gates. It was right before them. Because generally, it says in verse 11 that young maidens going out to draw water. In smaller towns, the watering hole would often be located outside of the city. In fact, in 2 Samuel chapter 23, verse 16, David makes a request of his men to go draw water for him from the wells of Bethlehem. And in that passage, it says that the men go and they draw the water from the well which was beside the gate, or on the outskirts of the city. So if we're trying to picture what's going on in our mind, picture Saul and the servant basically on the outside of the city, looking at the city, but they're by the watering hole. And they want to know the specific location where Samuel is at. Now, we do know that it was typically a job that women carried out to go and to draw water. You might recall Genesis chapter 24, that when Abraham sent out his servant to go find Isaac a wife, he met Rebekah drawing water in that passage. Same thing in Exodus chapter 2. After Moses has fled from Egypt, he goes to the land of Midian, and he encounters Jethro's daughters while they were going to draw water. So generally, what the Bible records for us is that this was often something that was seen to be a task for women to do. But they say in verse 11 that Samuel is, or they say in verse 12 that Samuel will be here. They answered them and said, "He is." The young maiden speaking here, "He is. Behold, he is before you. Make haste now, for he came today to the city, for there is a sacrifice of the people today in the high place." So, verse 12 might be a reference to the fact that he is returning from his circuit of work. You note in verse 12 how it picks up in speed. "He is here before you. Make haste now," or "hurry up, for he came today to the city." Again, might be a reference to how Samuel worked in his circuit, going around from town to town. So again, the point being, verse 12, the providence of God at work, because Saul and the servant have arrived at the perfect time. They had been there the day before. Perhaps he's not there. They don't stay in the city. But he's here that day, and maybe this is again the providence of God at work. You note in verse 12 that there is a sacrifice of the people today in the high place. Sometimes feasts were often held in conjunction with the sacrifice, because when the animals are sacrificed, again, the Levites were allowed to eat some of the meat. And if we remember from 1 Samuel chapter 1, Elkanah and his family had gone to Shiloh, and it was before Hannah goes to the temple to pray, they were eating together. And this is maybe the idea of what's going on here, because later on Saul and his servant will attend a feast that Samuel is at. It says in verse 12, it might be important to point out that there is a sacrifice of the people today in the high place. We know that in a lot of cases in the Old Testament, when it talks about the high place, is a reference to idolatry, but obviously that's not what's being talked about here. Samuel's a man of God. He's not participating in this. So they come to the city, and the young maidens tell them where to go. They continue on, verse 13, "As soon as ye be come into the city, ye shall straightway find him before he go up to the high place to eat, for the people will not eat until he come, because he doth bless the sacrifice, and afterward they eat that be bidden. Now therefore get you up, for about this time you shall find him." And then verse 14, "And they went up into the city, and when they were come into the city, behold, Samuel came out against them for to go up to the high place." So apparently based on this, the people would not eat until Samuel had blessed the food. And obviously this talks about the respect that people had for Samuel, his reputation again. If you look at Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 13 through 18, Moses tells the people that there is a certain time and a certain place in which you can eat the meat that was given for a sacrifice. We've got about 5 minutes left, so I'll look at a couple verses from there. Deuteronomy chapter 12, verses 13 through 18. Now note verse 13, "Take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest, but in the place which the Lord shall choose in one of thy tribes, there shalt offer thy burnt offerings, and there thou shalt do all that I command thee." So that's sort of the context here. But you know verse 17 and verse 18 of that chapter. "Thou mayest not eat within thy gates the tithe of thy corn, or of thy wine, or of thy oil, or of the firstlings, or of thy herds, or of thy flock, nor any of thy vows which thou vowest, nor thy freewill offerings or heave offering of thine hand. But thou must eat them before the Lord thy God in the place which the Lord thy God shall choose." And so the point being is that there was a specific location in which the people were commanded to eat in this manner. And perhaps in keeping with that, that was out of respect for Samuel that they wait for him to bless the food. Either way, the point is that Samuel's about to be there. You, Saul and your servant, you need to hurry up and get there so you don't miss him when he goes in. So verse 13, it says, verse 13, "Before you go up to the high place to eat, for the people will not eat till he come." Okay, at the end of verse 13, sorry. "Now therefore get you up, for about this time you shall find him," or now, at this time, meaning right now. In verse 14, we see that they meet Samuel. Samuel came out against them for to go up to the high place. And so Saul and his servant begin on a journey to find lost donkeys, but by the end of this, they've arrived and met the man of God who's going to give Saul a very life-changing message and a life-changing command that he will need to abide by because God has expected him and appointed him as king over Israel. So next week we'll pick up in verse 15 where we talk about God communicating to Samuel about this matter and the conversation that takes place between Samuel and Saul. But again, thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention tonight. And we will pick up next week in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 15.